Hello everybody, Dr. Alex Vasquez here on September 1st of 2019. Today I'm going to discuss antiviral strategies, which is a topic that I first started to talk about in 2014 when I published kind of the updated version of the antiviral strategy, which had been previously published in 2009 and was then formally published as a separate book in 2014. So we'll take a look at some of that past information, and then of course as quickly as possible, I will try to dive into today's information, which is basically going to kind of set the stage, so to speak, for some future presentations where I'll get into more detail. But what I think is necessary today, since I haven't really discussed this topic in detail for about the past 5 years, at least not in a video presentation format such as this, what I'd like to do is kind of revisit the structure, and then in future videos, that will enable me to dive right into therapeutics, but I, of course, think that context is very important, so I am going to kind of refresh the context for this antiviral strategy here in today's presentation. So as I just stated, I published this antiviral strategy in 2009 for the first time, and then formalized it and gave it some structure in 2014. So this was initially published in 2009, in a book called Chiropractic and Naturopathic Mastery of Common Clinical Disorders. Then it was updated in 2014 for Naturopathic Rheumatology version 3.5, which is now published as Inflammation Mastery 4th edition in 2016. So after updating that information and providing some structure to that new protocol, I called it Antiviral Strategies and Immune Nutrition, also published as an ebook simply titled Antiviral Nutrition. I also published this in an article that's available online. You can see the hyperlink provided here. This was also published in a blog, which I'm actually quite proud of. The title of this blog is "The Proof is in the Panic. We Need a New Strategy Against Viral Infections." You can find that online. Also a conference presentation at the International Congress on Naturopathic Medicine in 2016. You can find that video online as well. Also various videos and internet articles at ichnfm.org, antiviral, and that series progresses from antiviral 1 to antiviral 2, antiviral 3, antiviral 4, etc. Also on inflammationmastery.com, antiviral, I have kind of a summary there with several videos previously made. The major thesis presented in this work is that only by understanding viral infections can we prevent and treat them rationally and effectively. And what I really mean there is having a conceptual model that helps us manage these viral infections from a clinical standpoint, not from a pathology standpoint or microbiologic standpoint, but what can we actually understand and then leverage that understanding into something that actually works in the real world, and that will be the emphasis here. I reasonably propose that most physicians do not have an articulated or clear understanding of viral infections. That's just my opinion, and you can agree or disagree. But that opinion comes from a lot of experience in education and administration, and also from having attended a leading U.S. medical school where I also scored in the top 1% and top 5% on 4 different U.S. medical licensing exams. Also, while I was in medical school, I was an honor student. I also did a predoctoral research fellowship through the National Institutes of Health, etc. And I've also studied various educational structures, and I've surveyed and followed the literature now for decades. So again, you can take or leave certain things that I say as my opinion, but that is my opinion, that most doctors don't understand viral infections from a clinical standpoint, and you can agree or disagree, but I think that my opinion is reasonable. So again, if we treat a condition, and in this case I'm talking about viral infections, if we try to treat these viral infections without a really good structured understanding, then in my opinion we're just fooling ourselves and we're just throwing drugs at what is really just a mystery to us. So what I'm going to try to develop in these videos is what I've already developed in the books, and that is to provide a structure and a structured understanding of viral infections that can be used clinically as well as in research and public health, etc. So let's start with some questions here. So everyone has an opinion, and many people think they're knowledgeable. That is, until someone asks a question. So I am going to start by proposing or challenging some questions here. So let's start here with an assessment of some basic knowledge. Again, I think that most physicians cannot answer these questions. So let's start with an open-ended question. Discuss the process of viral infection from start to finish. And then later we might advance that to provide an overview and then list specific nuances for common illnesses. So I'm sure that if you think about this question, you'll agree that it's a very reasonable question. Discuss the process of viral infection from start to finish. So we all talk about viral infections on the internet, in journal articles, in research conferences, in clinical conferences, etc. But let's give structure to that conversation. Instead of just throwing out this concept of viral infection, discuss what it is from start to finish. So we should all be able to agree on some basic components of what is a viral infection. And I could easily propose, and I am proposing here, that unless we have an agreed upon structure and agreed upon understanding, then we're all using this phrase viral infection and measles epidemic and all this conversation, but unless we know and have some agreement on what that term actually means, then we're using words, but we're really not communicating very effectively. So here's a different version of the same question. This is a guiding question, and this question I've kind of structured at a basic science level. List the 4 main components of a viral infection. So what are the 4 main components of a viral infection? Some people might say, well, maybe we can come up with 3, or maybe we can come up with 5 or 6, but I think that we should keep this list as short as possible while still being complete. And in my review of the research and having studied this for 20-something years, I've come up with 4 main components, and I think that those components are the most important. Again, somebody else might say 3 components or 6 components or whatever. I've chosen 4, and I would invite anyone to argue with me on this or debate in any manner whatsoever. But in my opinion, we can't say less than 4, and we could say more than 4, but I think that would be unnecessary. So if we were to advance this question to a clinical level, the question would be phrased, or could be phrased in this way: list the 4 main components of a viral infection and provide conceptual interventions for each. And then provide actual clinical, real-world interventions, dose, risks, mechanisms, benefits, and any collateral benefits. So again, if we're going to discuss viral infections, we need to understand what we're talking about. We need to have a defined and structured understanding of what that concept means. And that's important for research perspectives, for public health perspectives, and also, of course, clinical perspectives, whether we're treating patients or whether we are parents treating our children, or, of course, treating ourselves when we do get sick. So 4 main components. If you really understand that, then you would be able to understand 4 interventions, or 4 levels of interventions, we might say. And then based on that, you would or should be able to discuss what are some of the treatments that you would actually implement. So again, we go from understanding to a conceptualization of how we might approach each aspect of that understanding, and then how do we actually intervene. So components of the infection, ways to address each aspect of the infection, and then what do you actually do? Doses, risks, mechanisms, benefits, collateral benefits, cost effectiveness, etc. So here's question number 2, and again, we're just getting started here. So we're going to look at an image that comes from a really good journal, a good series of journals called the Trends journals. This one happens to be Trends in Pharmacological Sciences, published in 2014. The title of this article is Current Progress in Antiviral Strategies. And the image that I'm going to present to you is titled A Schematic Representation of the Viral Life Cycle. So I'm not criticizing this journal, I'm not criticizing the author, and I'm not even really criticizing the image. I'm just using this image as a representative example of what a typical medical student or medical doctor or medical resident would study in any given pathology or microbiology textbook. This is a very typical example. Now, of course, this is specific to this particular article, but in any pathology or microbiology book, you would find a diagram that looks more or less like this. So again, I'm simply using this diagram as a representative example of how medical students are taught and how doctors are taught. when they are being taught about how viral infections propagate and progress, and therefore how antiviral strategies such as antiviral drugs can be employed. So let's take a look at this diagram and identify any errors, either molecular errors or conceptual errors. So I would say, for example, when looking at this diagram, that it's not quite a cartoon, but it's also certainly not very detailed. For some people, they might look at this and say, wow, that's a lot of information, but it's actually not. A lot more is happening in the entry of viruses and the production of viral particles on the other side. So when we look at a diagram like this, we're kind of getting a cartoon-like image. And I think that what I just said there is actually important, because if doctors are taught in a cartoon-like way, then the interventions that they employ conceivably might also be somewhat comedic. So anyway, let's take a look at this. Identify any errors. Let's assume that the diagram is factually correct, but what else is missing? If this is how we're going to see viral infections, what is missing from this story, if anything? Maybe you think it's perfect the way that it is. So what are the implications of relying on such a model? So I will answer those questions at the end of this presentation. While I was preparing this exact presentation that we're looking at right now, I did look at the medical literature to see what's kind of developed over the last couple of years. I found this book, Antiviral Strategies, from 2009. Very interestingly, this book does not contain a single chapter on nutrition or improvement of host defense. So I think some of you are probably picking up now on what I'm trying to convey here, and that is, if our model for viral infection is inadequate, then our treatments for viral infections will likewise be inadequate. So this is an entire textbook written for medical professionals, and again published in 2009, 13 chapters, not a single chapter on host defense or nutrition. And in my opinion, any reasonable conversation on antiviral strategies would have to mention host defense and nutrition to support a proper and effective and robust immune response. So how can that be excluded from this conversation on such a consistent basis? Ultimately, my goal here is to decipher and deconstruct the phenomena of viral infections so that we can have insights that lead to better treatments. I've studied viral infections in several different capacities, mostly independently after my graduate education, which for me started in chiropractic college. I graduated from chiropractic college in 1996. I actually attended 2 different chiropractic colleges, and in the course of that education, we had courses in public health, microbiology, like basic microbiology, followed by clinical microbiology, and also courses in pathology. Because the treatment of infectious diseases was largely considered outside the scope of practice for chiropractic, these classes were treated in a very peripheral manner, and we had no conversation on therapeutics whatsoever, except we did have some conversation on maybe like how to treat a common cold, for example, in our clinical nutrition course, which was taught by a naturopathic physician. So again, that was my experience from having attended 2 different chiropractic colleges and graduating in 1996. After chiropractic college, I immediately went to naturopathic medical school. I graduated from that school in 1999, about 3.5 years later. I was given some credit for previous education in anatomy, physiology, pathology. That's why I was able to do a 4-year program in 3.5 years. So in naturopathic medical school, we had excellent instruction in basic microbiology, which I actually had to repeat. So I took basic and clinical microbiology in chiropractic college, then I had to repeat those courses in naturopathic school. Again, basic microbiology, clinical microbiology, and I would say that our class was actually quite excellent. Then, throughout the duration of our education in naturopathic medical school, we also had antiviral strategies and antiviral therapeutics integrated into our other courses, such as gynecology, EENT or eye, ear, nose, throat, also pediatrics and dermatology. So of my 3 graduate doctorate level degrees, naturopathic medicine certainly provided the best education in the treatment of infectious diseases. Then after I graduated in 1999, I practiced in Seattle, Washington. Then I practiced in Houston, Texas for a while. And then later I went to osteopathic medical school and I graduated from that school in 2010. Our training in infectious diseases in osteopathic medical school was that we were presented with a 400-page textbook and told to go home and read it by yourself. Your exam is in 10 days, or it might have been 14 days, but about 2 weeks. So, of course, panic and protest ensued to no avail other than reading as fast as possible and mostly memorizing minutia, which is how medical school education and testing seem to function. These days, medical school really isn't set up to produce clinicians. Medical school is set up to prepare people for two things primarily. One is taking board exams, because that's how medical schools rank each other, and everybody wants, all these medical schools want to appear as so-called best medical school, and they base that largely on board exam performance. So medical school, unfortunately, isn't really so much designed to create good clinicians as it is to promote the image of the school itself through high board exam scores, and also to prepare medical students for medical residency. So that's a real tragedy, of course, because medical school should be producing competent clinicians, not good test takers and kind of drones for the medical residency programs. So again, in summary, from my experience, having attended and graduated from 3 different accredited graduate doctorate level programs, naturopathic medicine really provided the best education for the treatment and understanding of infectious diseases. As I said before, I consider this to be a legitimate tragedy that medical schools are not really preparing students for their roles as clinicians, but rather preparing them to take exams and then preparing them to work in medical residency programs. As a result, from the best I can tell, medical students and residents actually learn very little about infectious diseases, practically zero regarding vaccines, a little bit more perhaps about antiviral drugs, but they are taught nothing other than ridicule about clinical nutrition, and they learn absolutely nothing about higher level integrative nutrition and functional nutrition, such as I'm discussing in this series of videos and also, of course, in my books. So this ultimately becomes the perfect formula for producing arrogant professionals that know nothing other than how to endorse and rely completely on vaccines and antiviral drugs while kind of scoffing and belittling other options that they haven't even been trained in. So it's a kind of a dangerous educational formula. Let's look at some data that substantiates what I just said. So here's an article published in Journal of Public Health, Practice and Management, 2013. And ultimately what this article shows is that medical resident physicians are undertrained in critical aspects of what they discuss here as quote-unquote vaccine safety. So you can see what I highlighted here. 20% of the residents in either pediatrics or family medicine reported not learning about vaccine safety communication in their residency programs. So what is meant here by vaccine safety communication actually has nothing to do with helping patients navigate this information. What this has to do with is convincing people to receive vaccines. This really doesn't have to do with patient care other than convincing people to overcome their so-called vaccine hesitancy and increase their uptake and therefore the sales of vaccines. So indirectly, what this research shows is that physicians are not being trained in the proper administration of vaccines. And you can see the conclusion here. And unfortunately, I have to categorize this type of research as being somewhat imbecilic, because what should be focused on in educational research such as this is the proper education of students and residents, not simply training these doctors to be salesmen and saleswomen for the vaccine industry. Let's look at another study. So again, this one was published in 2013. Let's look at this study published in 2014. You'll see it's actually quite similar. Most pediatric residency programs surveyed do not include formal training on vaccine safety, yet such training is supported by pediatric residency program directors as a priority for pediatric residents. Why? Because these people are going to go on to have their careers largely center around the sales and use of vaccines. So, I think that the main priority of medical training, whether as medical students or in medical residency programs, the main priority should be safe and effective and cost-effective and ethical treatment of our patients. I think that's the big and primary responsibility. Not being trained in how to sell vaccines, which is basically what's happening. And what they call here vaccine safety really doesn't have to do with safety for patients. What's being communicated in these programs, as you can see also on the following article that I'll look at in a little bit more detail, what's being communicated in these so-called vaccine safety education programs is how to overcome doubt for the goal of selling and promoting vaccine usage. So here, for example, let's look at this study published in 2015 in a journal called Current Drug Safety, teaching vaccine safety communication to medical students and health professionals. So again, what I really think is the biggest point to understand about what these articles are saying is that medical students and residents are untrained in the proper and ethical use of vaccines. And when they are trained, the conversation around their so-called training is this so-called vaccine safety education, which ultimately becomes nothing more than a sales pitch. So let's look closely at what's stated in this article, again from 2015. In many medical school curricula in German-speaking countries, the subject of vaccines has been entirely omitted or is regarded as a minor subtopic. During the studies, that is medical school and residency, most medical school curricula in German-speaking countries do not offer obligatory courses and/or hands-on training in vaccinology and vaccinations. The authors go on to state, even during postgraduate training programs in pediatrics, which are largely hospital-based, vaccinations are rarely a topic. So you have to appreciate and perhaps be stunned by what's being stated here. Medical students and medical residents, generally speaking, are not being educated properly about vaccines at all, even though their careers depend on the sales of vaccines, especially in the practice of pediatrics. So let's take a look at a few more details from this study. What's stated here is, once established, good communication practices should usually prevail. Again, we have to distinguish between two types of good communication. One is authentic, clear, honest, ethical communication, where patients are informed of the potential risks and benefits of each individual treatment. What's being discussed here under the umbrella or the disguise of good communication and vaccine safety is nothing more than a sales pitch on how to overcome vaccine hesitancy and overcome the questions that parents have about the proper utilization of vaccines, including what does the research actually show. So again, vaccine safety communication is being kind of a code phrase or code term for teaching medical students and residents to become ambassadors of the vaccine industry and promoting sales and uptake of vaccines. So let's conclude based on these three studies, and of course another mountain of practical experience that we have, doctors and residents are not being properly educated about the true nature of vaccines. Likewise, they are not being trained at all in basic nutrition, let alone interventional nutrition, and then certainly not integrative and functional nutrition such as I discuss. And this is well established. I'll just show you a good survey of the literature here. Let's look at this article from 2018. Most medical schools and residency programs do not offer any organized training whatsoever in nutrition or lifestyle medicine. The authors go on to describe what they consider to be an absolute need for drastic reform in the U.S. medical education system. Well, that's not going to happen because medical education isn't designed to teach doctors and residents about nutrition nor about lifestyle medicine. The practice of medicine is simply that. It is the practice of the distribution of medicine. We all like to think of it in terms of patient care, but patient care is very different from the practice of medicine, even though I'm sure most people don't want to hear it stated as such. If patient care were the priority of medicine, then of course we would learn about nutrition, we would learn about lifestyle, we would learn about counseling people, not simply drugging them when they come in with a self-report of depression, but we would learn about kind of the existential and social basis for depression, rather than simply assuming it's a neurotransmitter imbalance that is best managed through the use of pharmaceutical drugs. But before I digress too much, let's look at some more research here. This article comes from the journal Family Medicine. This was published in 2017. Medical students felt nutrition was poorly integrated into the curriculum. They witnessed little nutrition counseling during shadowing experiences in hospitals and clinics, and the nutrition information that was imparted was often outdated or incorrect. Medical students and physicians agreed that the nutrition education currently provided in medical school is inadequate. So you're going to see that this is a well-established concept that medical education does not include any instruction in nutrition at any level, basic level, clinical level, or integrative functional level. It's just not happening. And this has been going on for decades and decades, and it's not going to change because the intention of medical school is not to train people in the practice of nutrition. Here's another article from 2017, Nutrition Education for Cardiologists, The Time Has Come. Guidelines for internal medicine residency and cardiovascular fellowship training do not contain any specific requirement for nutrition education. So let's look at another article here. This comes from the Association of American Medical Colleges. This was published in 2010. Conclusions: the amount of nutrition education that medical students receive continues to be inadequate. Another article here from 1999 states that present-day practitioners of medicine are typically untrained in the relationship of diet to health and disease. Another article here, Deficiency of Nutrition Education and Practice of Cardiology, 2017. A large proportion of cardiovascular specialists have received minimal medical education and training in nutrition, and current trainees continue to experience significant education and training gaps. Certainly the understatement of the year. What do resident physicians know about nutrition? This was published in 2008. Internal medicine interns perceive nutrition counseling as a priority, but lack the confidence and knowledge to effectively provide adequate nutrition education. And finally here from 2009, Journal of Clinical Gastroenterology. Gastroenterology fellows think their knowledge of nutrition is suboptimal, and objective evaluation of nutrition knowledge confirm this belief. So this is actually remarkable, if not stunning, to consider that gastroenterology physicians whose practice centers around the maintenance of this tube called the gastrointestinal tract, which basically is designed and exists for the reception of nutrients in the form of food, they aren't even trained in anything related to nutrition or diet. And their entire professional career centers around managing this gastrointestinal tube which receives food. So that's kind of a paradox and kind of stunning. So let's begin to summarize this information and move forward. So the fact is, medical physicians are mostly untrained in vaccines and antiviral drugs, and they are completely untrained in nutrition. So upon the day of graduation, medical students basically know nothing about vaccines, nothing about antiviral drugs, and nothing about nutrition. So they start, we might say, at kind of an even or equalized playing field, ignorant on the one hand, they're ignorant about antiviral strategies in terms of drugs and vaccines, and on the other hand, they're also ignorant about nutrition completely, again, at the basic level, at the clinical level, and at the interventional or functional nutrition level. So why then, when they graduate at a level of what we might call equal ignorance, why then do they go on to scorn nutrition and embrace vaccines and antiviral drugs? Let's take a look at a few things that might influence their behavior. Now again, what's been shown in the educational research and what we know from experience is that upon the day of graduation, and I'm just using that as kind of an intermediate point in their training between medical school and medical residency, at the day of graduation, they know nothing about nutrition, nothing about vaccines, and very little about antiviral drugs. So, complete ignorance on this topic, and yet they go on to embrace drugs and vaccines and continue to disdain nutrition. So why would that happen? What are the factors that create that imbalance? Let's look at a few of those as I've listed here. Here's a brief list that I made recently. Part of the reason for this is what's called the repetition compulsion, which is actually systematic and actually embedded within the structure of medical education. This is ultimately the power of the medical paradigm, which at least in part includes mindless and robotic repetition of what has been done previously, which is called the standard of care, regardless of the value of that treatment. Forced conformity. Medical training is characterized by hazing, bullying, sleep deprivation, social isolation. Most people trapped in the system internalize the values and attitudes of their captors as a survival strategy. This is also known somewhat differently, but also related to what's called Stockholm Syndrome. Also, medical education programs, both at the medical school level and the residency level, require mandatory vaccines. So, any medical student or any medical resident who questions those vaccines is going to be set up to be filtered out of the system.
You can remember cases where a teacher really made a terrific impression on you. I mean, most schooling is just training for stupidity and conformity. But every once in a while, and that's institutional too, there are reasons for that. But occasionally, you get a spark. Somebody will challenge your mind, make you think, encourage you to think, and so on. And that's a tremendous effect. You just reach all sorts of people. Of course, if you do it, you're going to be, you may very well have problems. You have to tread a narrow line. There are plenty of people who don't want students to think. They're afraid of the crisis of democracy. People start thinking and you get all these problems I was quoting at the beginning. They won't have humility enough to submit to a civil rule, or they'll start trying to press their demands in the political arena, or they'll, have ideas of their own instead of believing what they're told. And privilege and power typically doesn't want that, so they can react. And a high school teacher who tries to get students to think may find repression, firing, and so on.
You said a lot about the role of the media in a so-called democracy. I'm wondering how you see the role of our educational system, what it's doing right now, what forces are driving it, and what constraints are on it, and how should it operate?
Mm-hmm. Well, I quoted the Trilateral Commission view of the educational system, namely it's a system of indoctrination of the young. And I think that's correct. It's a system of indoctrination of the young. That was the way the liberal elites regard it, and they're more or less accurate. So the educational system is supposed to train people to be obedient, conformist, not think too much, do what you're told, stay passive, don't cause any crises of democracy, don't raise any questions, and so on. That's basically what the system is about. Even the fact that the system has a lot of stupidity in it, I think, has a function. It means that people are filtered out for obedience. Even the fact that the system has a lot of stupidity in it, I think, has a function. It means that people are filtered out for obedience. If you can guarantee lots of stupidity in the educational system, like stupid assignments and things like that, that the only people who will make it through are people like me and like most of you, I guess, who are willing to do it no matter how stupid it is, because we want to go to the next step, So you may know that this assignment is idiotic and the guy up there couldn't think his way out of a paper bag, but you'll do it anyway because that's the way you get to the next class, and you want to make it, and so on and so forth. Well, there are people who don't do that, There are people who say, I'm not going to do it, it's too ridiculous, Those people are called behavioral problems, or something like that. They end up in the principal's office or in the streets or selling drugs or whatever. And all of this is a technique for selection for obedience. And all of this is a technique for selection for obedience. And I don't know how to prove this, but I have a feeling that when you go to the elite universities, you find more obedience and conformity, probably because you're getting the students who were better able to do it, Well, all of that is functional. That's the way it works. And it works right through graduate school.
So ultimately, at the end of this factory assembly line that creates so-called medical physicians, the ultimate product is going to be someone who conforms to and doesn't question vaccines. Also in medicine, we see a progressive reward system for pharmaceutical supplication. If you'll bow down to the pharmaceutical drug gods, You can definitely get rich in medicine. The more that one behaves like a puppet to the money masters, that is, Big Pharma, the more one's career in medicine advances. Research grants, publications, teaching positions, presentations at conferences. Number 4, reimbursement in the hospital and training systems. Hospital systems are forced to conform to drug-centric standards. Again, sometimes, for example, those drug-centric standards actually don't have any legitimate value. For example, a lot of hospital residency programs and a lot of hospitals require their employees to get vaccinated even when the evidence has shown that that vaccination program has no value in neither protecting healthcare providers nor protecting the patients. Number 5, in-hospital training with severe cases not representative of routine clinical practice. So I'll explain that a little bit more here. In hospital residency programs that are based in hospitals, the cases that are going to be seen are the more severe cases that might legitimately require higher levels of medicalization. So we're talking about saving lives here. We're talking about emergency situations. When students and doctors are trained in that setting, what they lose or never gain in the first place is a perspective on how to treat milder cases in an outpatient setting. So, for example, if we're working in a hospital residency program and we see a patient come into the emergency department who's got full-blown AIDS and associated complicating infections, then of course we have to pull out the so-called big guns and treat that very aggressively. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean in clinical practice we would use lower doses of those same big guns. So, long-term management and prevention of disease is actually qualitatively different, not simply quantitatively different. It's qualitatively different from the treatment of these acute emergency situations. Number 6, advertising industry-sponsored continuing medical education and pharma-paid independent academic research centers. All of these things influence the way that doctors are educated, the way they're trained, what they read in their so-called downtime when they have it, and it ultimately becomes a huge funnel pushing doctors and medical students and residents in the direction of promoting drugs as therapeutics, and ultimately, of course, that promotes profitability for the drug industry. Infomercialized journal articles traps even the most innocent within a hall of mirrors of pro-pharmaceutical propaganda. Insurance reimbursement and increased profitability. Doctors are paid bonus cash